on the court and be like, let's do it.
Good, see?
There are blowouts that happen because one team simply shoots better on a given night. There are blowouts that happen because the opponent is overmatched from the opening tip. And then there are blowouts of an entirely different nature, ones that tell a deeper story, ones that are less about the scoreline and more about the imposition of a complete basketball philosophy onto another team. This was emphatically the latter kind. From the very first minutes of action, something was unmistakably clear. One team was in control not just of the basketball, but of the very heartbeat of the game itself. And the reason for that control had a name: Caitlin Clark. Let's be clear about what this performance was and what it was not. It was not simply a case of a talented player having a hot shooting night. It was not a random collection of highlight moments strung together into something that looks more impressive than it actually was. What Clark did in this game was far more fundamental and far more consequential than a flashy stat line or a series of pretty passes. She did something that only a rare category of basketball player can genuinely do. She decided how the game would be played. She determined the tempo, the rhythm, the pace, the urgency. She took the keys to the entire enterprise and drove it exactly where she wanted it to go. That is a different kind of dominance, and it deserves a different kind of conversation. Coming into this contest, a reasonable expectation might have been that Clark would settle into a somewhat measured role. Not passive, that would never be the right word for her, but perhaps more restrained than what we actually witnessed. The smart strategic thinking might have suggested that with veterans on the roster capable of shouldering scoring responsibilities, Clark could function primarily as the engine of the offense, the connector, the quarterback who gets everyone else into position and lets the playmakers do their work. Move the ball, make good decisions, keep things organized, and let the pieces around her handle the heavy lifting. She did all of that, every single bit of it. But she also did something on top of all of that, something that elevated the entire enterprise from merely functional to genuinely electric. She did not simply manage possessions. She weaponized them. She did not simply facilitate the offense. She stretched it, accelerated it, and gave it a dimension that it simply does not have without her presence on the floor. The most revealing thing about this performance was not any individual moment. It was the sustained, relentless quality of her influence across every minute she was on the court. There was never a stretch where you looked up and thought the team was running on autopilot. When Clark was out there, the offense felt alive in a way that demanded attention, demanded respect, and demanded that the opposition do something it could not quite manage: keep up. Here is what people sometimes misunderstand about pace in basketball. The conversation often defaults to a surface-level reading. Fast teams run, slow teams walk, and the fast teams score more points. That is true in the most reductive sense, but it badly misses the actual strategic value of what tempo control really means at its highest level. When a player of Clark's caliber controls the pace of a game, it is not simply about pushing the ball up the floor before the defense can get organized, though that is certainly part of it. The real value runs deeper. It is about forcing defenders to make decisions before they are fully comfortable, before their rotations are set, before their communication can kick in. It is about turning every possession into a miniature pressure test for 5 defenders who suddenly have to be in the right place not when they are ready, but when the offense demands it. Clark did this throughout the night. And what distinguished her from a player who simply plays fast is the precision with which she operated within that pace. There is a crucial difference between chaos and orchestration, and it is a difference that many players never fully grasp. Chaos happens when a player pushes the tempo beyond what their decision-making can sustain. Turnovers spike, possessions break down, the running game becomes counterproductive. Orchestration happens when a player pushes the tempo to exactly the edge of what the defense can handle, and then makes the right play every single time. Clark was orchestrating. Her passes came early, not recklessly early, not blindly thrown into traffic, but delivered in rhythm, on time, in precisely the window that allowed the receiver to catch and go rather than catch and reset. That distinction matters enormously. A pass that arrives 2 steps too late negates the entire advantage of the fast break. A pass that arrives in perfect rhythm multiplies the advantage, because now the receiver has options that simply would not exist if the ball came half a second slower. This is one of the things that makes Clark so difficult to fully capture in statistics, though her numbers were more than sufficient to tell the story on their own. The pass that creates an open three is counted as an assist. The pass that nearly creates an open three but requires one more pass to get there, that is invisible in the box score, but it is no less the product of her vision and her decision-making. The gravity she creates simply by being on the floor, the way defenses allocate attention toward her, creating space for teammates they might otherwise crowd, that does not show up in any column. Her 3 turnovers are worth addressing directly, because the surface reading of that number does not do justice to the actual context. 2 of those turnovers came in the closing seconds of a game that had already been decided by a wide margin. They were not symptoms of a player losing control of the game. They were the product of a player continuing to compete and take chances in garbage time. The third was a full-court attempt directed at Angel Reese, a pass that most players would not have the vision to attempt, and many would not have the courage to try. It did not connect, but the attempt itself spoke to the mentality Clark brought to every possession, not conservative, not tentative, but always seeing the opportunity 1 step ahead of what most players can perceive. Let us spend a moment with the production, because it is genuinely staggering when you put it in proper perspective. 19 minutes, that is the entirety of Clark's time on the floor, less than 20 minutes of basketball, and within that window she put up 17 points and 12 assists. She led the team in plus-minus. She finished second in scoring. She accounted for nearly half of all assists on the night. Now consider what that means offensively. When you factor in the points she scored directly and the points created by her assists, you arrive at approximately 33 points generated in under 20 minutes of play. That is not simply efficient. That is game-shaping production at a level that redefines what we expect from a player in limited minutes. If she had played 36 or 38 minutes the way starters typically do, the extrapolation of that performance is almost difficult to process. But the number that truly jumps off the page, the one that, if you know basketball, stops you cold, is the plus 35. In a team sport with 10 players on the floor at any given moment, where individual impact can be diffused across so many variables, a plus 35 in a single game in under 20 minutes is an extraordinary marker of individual influence. Plus-minus is an imperfect statistic like all statistics, but at its best it reflects something real. When you were on the floor, your team was better. Dramatically, consistently, undeniably better. That is what a plus 35 says, and the eye test in this game confirmed every digit of it. When Clark sat, the team's edge softened. The crispness of the offense faded. The pace became more manageable for the defense. The possessions that had previously felt dangerous from the moment of the rebound now felt like they needed to be set up, organized, brought under control before anything could happen. That contrast, sharp and immediate, was one of the most instructive things about the entire game. It was a controlled experiment in what one player's presence and absence does to a team's offensive identity. Ryan Howard had an outstanding game, and that point deserves to be made clearly and without qualification. She was aggressive, decisive, and productive in ways that kept the defense honest and gave the team a legitimate second source of offensive pressure. If someone constructed a player of the game argument around her performance, you could not dismiss it without at least engaging the evidence seriously. Her scoring was relentless, her decision-making was sharp, and she made the team more dangerous in exactly the way you need a secondary option to function. But even with Howard playing at that high level, Clark's fingerprints were on everything. Howard punished the defense. Clark bent it. Those are different things. One is about execution within the structure of the game. The other is about shaping what the structure of the game becomes in the first place. Kelsey Plum held her role together with quiet competence. She was not spectacular, and she was not asked to be, but she was steady. And steady has real value in a lineup that is pushing pace and making decisions fast. When the game gets quick and chaotic, and everyone around you is operating at high speed, the players who stay grounded and make simple, correct choices are often the ones who make the whole thing sustainable. Chelsea Gray, on the other hand, never quite found her footing. The rhythm that usually characterizes her game was elusive. Her decision-making, typically one of the most reliable things about her, lacked its usual sharpness. This is worth noting not as a criticism but as an observation, because it speaks to something important about what this team's identity is and is not. Gray is a tremendous basketball player, but the version of this team that Clark enables is built on pace and immediate pressure, and that is a style that favors certain players and asks challenging questions of others. Kalia Cooper had her moments. She was dangerous when attacking downhill, when the speed of the game was working in her favor. But she also missed some looks that she typically converts, which served as a reminder that even for talented players, operating at elevated pace while maintaining finishing efficiency is a skill that requires calibration. Paige Bueckers offered perhaps the most interesting subplot of the game. Early on, she wore the weight of the moment. You could see it, not in any dramatic failure, but in the particular kind of hesitation that comes when a player's mind is processing the enormity of the stage slightly faster than the game is giving her time to absorb it. Her offensive contributions were slow to arrive. But what she did in the meantime is the kind of thing that does not make highlight reels and does not get discussed in box score breakdowns. She competed. She defended at full effort. She picked up full court. She stayed active, stayed connected, stayed ready. And once her mind caught up to the moment and the game slowed down inside her head enough to open up in front of her, you could see the talent reemerge. The tools are unquestionably there. Sometimes the biggest games require a little settling in before they become your biggest games. Angel Reese gave the team exactly what her role demands, which is a harder thing to do than it sounds when that role requires setting aside ambitions for possessions and accepting that your value on a given night is measured in screens set, positions held, and battles won near the rim that nobody will highlight in a recap. She was physical, she was present, she was engaged, and the 4 personal fouls she accumulated were themselves a testament to how active she was in the contested spaces around the basket. A player with 4 fouls fought for position all night. That is what you want from her, and that is what she delivered. Durkika Hamby flashed real capability in transition, finishing with efficiency when the floor opened and the opportunity presented itself. In a game defined by pace, a player who can convert quickly in transition is exactly the kind of complementary piece that makes the whole system more threatening. One of the most instructive moments of the game did not come from any individual play or highlight sequence. It came during a stretch in the third quarter when the lineup leaned more heavily on veteran experience and pulled back from the pace-driven identity that Clark enables. This was an understandable adjustment. There are game situations where slowing things down is the right call, where experience and half-court execution are more valuable than speed and early offense. But what the stretch revealed was striking in its clarity. The offense lost its edge. The possessions became more deliberate, more predictable, more manageable for the defense. The spacing got less threatening. The energy that had characterized the game's best moments evaporated, replaced by something that looked competent but fundamentally less dangerous. The defense had time to communicate. Rotations arrived on schedule. Shooters were contested. The whole enterprise became something the opponent could organize itself against. This is not a condemnation of the veteran players involved. It is an observation about the nature of this team's highest ceiling. There is a version of this team that plays slower, more controlled basketball and is still good. And then there is a version that plays through Clark's pace and becomes something else entirely. Something that defenses genuinely cannot fully solve. Something that keeps pressure building even when the ball is not in the most dangerous hands. The third quarter stretch was the contrast that made the point undeniable. It was not just about the scoreline during that period. It was about the feeling of the game, the sense of who was actually in control, the question of which team felt like it was operating on its own terms, and which team felt like it was reacting to circumstances it could not fully anticipate. The other team competed. That should be acknowledged honestly and without condescension. There were players in that lineup who are genuine professional basketball players, who bring real effort and legitimate skills, and who did not simply fold without a fight. There were interesting wrinkles in their approach, most notably the experiment with a larger player handling some point guard responsibilities and attempting to use their size advantage when matched against Clark. In isolated moments, that created some different looks, some different matchup problems that required adjustment. But over the full game, the gap in quality was too wide to obscure. Effort was present on the other side. Resistance showed up in patches, but the separation in top-end control, offensive creativity, and sheer basketball intelligence was visible and sustained. This is what the difference between being good enough to compete and being good enough to control elite competition actually looks like in practice. It is not always about talent in the abstract. It is about the ability to take over the terms of an engagement and keep your opponent in a reactive posture rather than a proactive one. Clark and Howard represented players operating at the highest level available in this game. And that difference, between players who belong and players who dominate, is what pushed this result from a competitive game that happened to go wrong for one team into the kind of performance that demands a larger conversation. The implications of this game extend well beyond its final score. When a performance of this kind happens, when a player demonstrates not just individual excellence but a genuine and transformative impact on everything around her, it raises questions that cannot be easily dismissed or deferred to future consideration. The question of Clark's role going forward, particularly with eyes turning toward 2028, becomes increasingly difficult to answer in any way that does not put her at the center of everything. Not because she is simply the most talented individual on the roster, though her case for that designation is compelling, but because of something harder to quantify and more important to understand. She changes what is possible for everyone around her. Her pace changes the geometry of the floor. This is not a metaphor. When Clark pushes tempo the way she did in this game, the physical distances between defenders and their assignments increase. Gaps open. Windows appear in rotations that would be closed if the offense moved more slowly. The same shot that a teammate might take from a contested position becomes an open look, simply because Clark has moved the ball and forced a decision before the defense could close out. That is geometry. That is real. Her passing changes what teammates are willing to attempt. This is also not a metaphor. When players know that a teammate will find them, not sometimes, not when things are going well, but consistently, reliably, as a matter of course, they run harder, cut more decisively, and sprint the lane with genuine purpose rather than half-effort. They fill positions knowing the ball is actually coming. This is what great passers do that goes beyond the technical execution of the pass itself. They create belief. They make their teammates feel seen, feel viable, feel dangerous in ways they might not feel otherwise. And once teammates feel that way, they become more dangerous, which creates more opportunities, which validates the passing, which builds more belief. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. Her presence changes how defenses prepare. Every hour of scouting, every defensive scheme designed for this team, every game plan constructed in an opponent's film session, all of it has to start with Clark. Where is she? What does she want to do? How do we limit her ability to push pace early? How do we stop her from setting up shooters in transition before we're ready? When a single player commands that much of the opponent's preparation, every other player on the team benefits, even in moments when Clark herself is not touching the ball. One of the less discussed but deeply important functions of a performance like this is what it reveals about chemistry, about which players thrive in a given environment and which players are still finding their way within it. When a team plays at the pace Clark enables, certain things become immediately apparent. Players who trust the speed, who have the conditioning and the decision-making to function in a faster game, look energized. You can see it in how they run the lanes. You can see it in the confidence of their footwork as they arrive at spots they know the ball is going to find. You can see it in the decisiveness of their shot selection, because they are not catching and reconsidering. They are catching and shooting, catching and finishing, because the whole system has created the conditions for immediate action. And you can also see the players who are still calibrating, not failing, necessarily, not doomed to fail, but in the process of figuring out how their game, which may have developed in a different environment or a different pace, meshes with this particular version of the offense. That calibration is not a character flaw. It is simply a reality of basketball, a reminder that talent is always somewhat context-dependent, and that even excellent players sometimes need time to find their best self within a new system. What Clark does for the players who are calibrating is give them a framework to calibrate within. When you have a player running the offense who is always one step ahead, always seeing the play before it develops, always delivering the ball in the right rhythm at the right time, even players who are still figuring out the pace have a reference point. They can see what the offense is supposed to look like when it's working. They can feel the difference between possessions that are late and possessions that are in rhythm. That is an education available nowhere else, and it has real long-term value for a team trying to build something coherent. There has been no shortage of discussion about guard roles, about rotations, about who should be in charge of this team's offensive identity, and how the minutes should be distributed among genuinely talented players. These are legitimate conversations, and they do not have easy answers. Building a roster around multiple elite players is always complicated, because elite players often have competing needs, competing preferences, and competing visions for how the game should be played. But games like this one have a way of cutting through the noise. When the evidence is clear enough and sustained enough and comprehensive enough, the debate starts to lose its energy. Not because everyone agrees, debate rarely disappears entirely in basketball, but because the gap between what is possible with a player at the center of everything and what is possible without her becomes hard to unsee once you have seen it clearly. This was a game where the gap was visible, not just in the box score, not just in the final margin, but in the texture of the game itself, in the feeling of control versus reaction, of pace versus scrambling, of a team operating within its identity versus a team trying to impose an identity that does not quite fit the night's circumstances. Clark gives this team an offensive identity that is genuinely difficult to replicate. The combination of pace control, passing vision, decision-making speed, and gravity she creates is not something you can redistribute among multiple players and get the same result. It is a specific kind of contribution that comes from a specific kind of player, and those players do not come along with regularity. The final margin in this game was not particularly close, but as with all truly instructive performances, the score is almost the least important part of the story. What matters is everything underneath the score, the how and the why of the outcome, the patterns that explain not just this game but the direction in which this team is headed. What this game proved, more convincingly than any argument could, is what this team looks like when Caitlin Clark is not simply participating in the offense but defining it. There is a meaningful distinction between those two things. Participating means executing within a system. Defining means creating the system, dictating its character, determining how fast it moves and how much pressure it applies and how many options it opens for everyone involved. Clark was defining, and when she defines, the ceiling of this team rises to a level that is genuinely exciting to contemplate. There will be more games, more debates, more questions about rotations and roles and the best way to use the talent available. That is the nature of any team sport. The conversation never fully settles, and it should not, because complacency is the enemy of improvement. But the conversation moving forward should be anchored in what this game demonstrated, because that evidence is too clear and too comprehensive to dismiss. When the floor is open and the game is moving at Clark's pace, defenses are not simply losing. They are being dismantled, systematically and deliberately, by a player who understands the game at a level that makes everything she does look inevitable in retrospect. Teammates are not simply scoring. They are doing so in positions and at moments that would not exist without her creating them. The offense is not simply functioning. It is operating as a genuine threat on every possession, a threat that begins the moment the previous possession ends. That is what a generational offensive talent does to a team. That is the difference between being very good and being transformative. And based on everything this game showed, the rest of the basketball world is going to spend a significant amount of time learning to adjust to exactly this version of the story, because it is not a one-off. It is a glimpse of what is coming, and what is coming looks like a reckoning. The debate gets quieter when the game looks like this, and right now, the game looks unmistakably like this.